October 12, 2021, 7:45 a.m. The hospital cleaning staff opened the door to a small apartment on the outskirts of Dubai. A nurse had failed to report for her morning shift. What they found would haunt them. A woman in her late 20s, sprawled across the bed, with faint bruising around her neck and an empty pill bottle on the nightstand. The official report would later suggest suicide, but the inconsistencies in her death scene ignited suspicion. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms, its air heavy with the residue of sleep that never ended. Morning light crept in through half-drawn curtains, painting pale stripes across the floor. The kitchen smelled faintly of boiled rice and jasmine oil. On the counter, a mug of tea sat unfinished. Its surface cooled into a thin, rubbery film. The staff froze in the doorway. This wasn't the first time they had found someone who'd failed to wake, but something about this scene felt staged, too deliberate. The way her body rested, slightly turned toward the window. The way the empty blister pack had been flattened, almost ceremonially, beside her. The absence of her phone, charger cord dangling alone on the nightstand. Her name would soon echo through the hospital. Isla Maravilla, a Filipina nurse who had been working in Dubai for 5 years. Beloved by her patients for her soft voice and tireless patience. Known among her colleagues for her neatness. Her locker always organized, her uniform pressed as if ready for inspection. She was the kind of worker who never drew attention to herself. Until this morning. By 8 a.m., paramedics had arrived. The supervisor gave her account in a low, trembling voice, repeating details as though rehearsing them for herself. Bruises on the neck, pills on the table. No sign of forced entry. The guard nodded, scribbling into a notebook, though he avoided looking at the body too long. When the stretcher was wheeled out at 8:25, the neighborhood was already watching. Women leaned from balconies. Children in school uniforms clustered on the steps, murmuring in Tagalog and Urdu. They saw the white sheet, the curve of a human outline beneath it. None said her name aloud, but in the silence, everyone knew it. At Dubai General Hospital, word spread faster than any official memo. By 9:30 a.m., before the day shift had even finished morning rounds, Isla's absence was explained not as lateness but as loss. They said overdose. One nurse whispered in the staff lounge, fingers wrapped tightly around her paper cup of coffee. No, another corrected, lowering her voice though no one else was listening. They said, there were marks around her throat. By lunchtime, speculation had sprouted into stories, each retelling adding new details, some contradictory. She was depressed. She had problems back home. She was pregnant. She was involved with someone important. The hospital corridors became rivers of half-truths. Everyone careful, everyone listening. Those closest to her remembered small things. That she had been cheerful just days before, showing a strip of ultrasound photos to a colleague with shy pride. That she had been saving for her younger brother's college tuition. That she never once hinted at despair. Why would she, if she was expecting? A nurse from pediatrics asked softly, staring into the vending machine's glass as if it might answer. The silence that followed was heavy, almost accusatory. By early afternoon, the administration released its first statement. We regret to inform staff of the untimely passing of Nurse Isla Maravilla. The matter is under investigation. Please respect her memory and her family's privacy. The words were sterile, detached, written to prevent panic rather than offer comfort. Yet between the lines, people sensed what wasn't being said. On the 4th floor, near the executive offices, the air was different. Doors that usually stood open were closed. Calls that should have gone through were delayed. The assistant to the hospital director canceled a day's worth of meetings in a clipped tone that discouraged questions. Still, one name whispered itself into every pause. Dr. Salim Rahmani. The police catalogued Isla's belongings in the apartment by late afternoon. Clothes folded neatly in drawers, letters from home in Tagalog, stacks of remittance receipts with dates marked in red pen. Nothing out of place except the phone. Not in the nightstand. Not in the kitchen. Not in her bag. Maybe she sold it, one officer muttered, though even he didn't believe it. In the modern world, a missing phone was louder than any confession. Later, when reports surfaced of her pregnancy, when rumors connected her to names far above her station, the missing phone became more than absence. It became a question no one dared ask aloud. What was on it? Meanwhile, in the pediatric ward, Hesse sat beside her daughter Seela, who dozed fitfully under the glow of monitors. Hesse's mind was elsewhere, heavy with the knowledge she carried in her purse. A tiny hidden camera she had installed weeks earlier in Seela's hospital room, meant only to catch signs of neglect. What it had captured instead was something else entirely. In the grainy night vision footage, Isla appeared more than once. But she was not alone. A man entered quietly after midnight. His hand brushed against hers in a way no colleagues ever should. His voice, though low, carried authority. Dr. Salim Rahmani. Hesse had replayed it in disbelief. The hospital director and a nurse together, in her daughter's room of all places. Tender, intimate, wrong. For days, she had carried the secret like a stone in her chest. Should she tell Sokena, her longtime friend and the director's wife? Would it destroy their friendship? Or was silence worse? Now, with Isla's death announced as a suicide, the footage burned hotter in her conscience. Perhaps it explained too much. Perhaps it explained everything. By evening, the hospital corridors were hushed. Staff avoided the topic in open spaces, lowering their voices as though walls could listen. Patients noticed the change, the clipped words, the careful smiles. Something was wrong, though no one explained what. And behind the official narrative of suicide, shadows thickened. Why would a nurse who had been expecting, who had spoken of her future, suddenly end her life? Why had her phone disappeared? Why did the administration seem less shocked than inconvenienced? The inconsistencies lingered, unspoken but undeniable. This was not an accident, not a simple tragedy. It was the beginning of something larger, an unraveling that would expose power, betrayal, and the kind of secrets no hospital report would ever admit. She was born in the heat of a March afternoon in 1992, in a narrow house pressed between two others on a crowded street in Davao City. Her mother remembered the air being so heavy that even the chickens outside refused to move. From the beginning, Isla was the eldest, the one expected to carry more than her share. When she was 5, she learned to rock her baby brother's hammock while memorizing her alphabet. At 8, she was already bargaining with the fish vendor, standing on tiptoe to sound older, more convincing. Her father drove a tricycle that coughed black smoke, sometimes coming home with enough money to buy meat, other times with nothing at all. The family's survival ebbed and flowed like the tide, and Isla grew up listening to her parents whisper at night about unpaid debts. School was her escape. She liked the structure, the clean chalk lines on the blackboard, the rows of desks that smelled of wood and ink. Teachers praised her for her diligence, and she held onto their words as though they were rare coins. When she was 10, a neighbor's cousin returned from Saudi Arabia with gifts. Imported chocolates, cheap perfume, stories of salaries that seemed impossible. Isla listened from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, and thought, one day that will be me. Adolescence hardened her determination. By 14, she had decided nursing was her path. The profession had prestige in the Philippines, white uniforms, stethoscopes like garlands around the neck, and more importantly, it was a ticket abroad. Her parents nodded, proud, though they could not fathom how they would pay for tuition. Isla took on tutoring younger students in math and English, collected coins in a jar, and wrote her goal on the first page of every notebook. Nurse by 22. University life was a mixture of exhaustion and hunger. She often skipped meals to save money, surviving on bread rolls and weak coffee while memorizing anatomy charts. Her classmates admired her endurance, but few knew the desperation driving it. She felt it every time she saw her mother's calloused hands, every time her father returned home silent after a fruitless day of driving. To fail was unthinkable. To succeed was the only option. During clinical rotations, she developed a reputation for patience. She was the one who stayed with elderly patients when they cried at night, the one who adjusted pillows until they were just right. Supervisors marked her down as compassionate, a word that became her armor. But compassion did not pay tuition. When she graduated in 2014, she walked across the stage in borrowed shoes, the tassel on her cap frayed. But she smiled as if she were already standing in a different world. The board exams nearly broke her. The pressure was immense. Whole families waited outside testing halls, praying aloud for their children's success. When Isla saw her name on the pass list, she pressed her hands to her face and wept, not only for herself but for the siblings who would now have a chance to study longer, eat better, dream bigger. The next step was the most difficult. Thousands of young nurses scrambled for the few coveted positions abroad. Agencies charged fees they could barely afford. Isla borrowed from relatives, promising to repay once her first remittance arrived. Weeks turned into months as she waited for interviews, her hopes rising and falling with each phone call. Finally, in late 2016, the offer came, a contract in Dubai General Hospital. The salary was modest by Gulf standards but transformative for a family accustomed to stretching every peso. Leaving was both victory and wound. Her mother clutched her at the airport, whispering prayers, while her youngest sister cried so hard her nose bled. Isla forced herself not to look back, because she knew if she did, she might not leave at all. The first weeks in Dubai were a blur of noise and neon. The city's skyscrapers dazzled her, but the distances between them felt inhuman. The hospital dormitory was cramped, 6 beds to a room, the air conditioning humming like an untiring insect. She learned quickly that loneliness could feel like a physical ache. Calls home were expensive. Internet connections failed. At night, she lay awake listening to the muffled cries of other women who, like her, had left everything behind. Work was relentless. Shifts stretched to 12 hours, sometimes longer. Patients spoke in languages she didn't understand, their frustration spilling into sharp words. Senior staff barked orders, and mistakes were punished with humiliation. Still, she kept her head down, her smile soft. Slowly, her supervisors began to notice her reliability. She was the one who stayed calm when a patient's family shouted, the one who worked an extra shift without complaint. Money was her measure of progress. Each month she sent remittances back to Devo, watching the balance in her own account remain stubbornly small. She knew where every peso went. Her brother's college tuition, her sister's school books, her parents' medicine. She kept nothing for herself beyond the basics. Other nurses bought handbags and smartphones. Isla bought phone cards to call home more often. Dubai was dazzling but cold. She wandered the malls, overwhelmed by glass and marble, yet bought only the cheapest meals in food courts. She rarely went out with colleagues, preferring to stay in her room and read the letters her siblings wrote. The city promised opportunity, but it offered little comfort. There were moments when the weight of it threatened to crush her. She remembered one night, after a 14-hour shift, collapsing onto her bunk bed still in uniform, her hands trembling so badly she couldn't untie her shoelaces. She whispered to herself, just endure, and she did. The years passed. Her reputation solidified. Humble, hardworking, invisible. She had few friends, but she had the respect of those who mattered. Patients often asked for her by name. Doctors noted her quiet efficiency. She remained grateful for the stability, though deep inside she wondered if she was slowly disappearing into her own sacrifice. Beneath her modest surface, vulnerability grew. Every decision she made was tethered to survival, every hope dependent on forces beyond her control. Employers, visas, contracts. Authority frightened her, but it also held her like a magnet. When someone in power noticed her, whether with a nod of approval or a rare kind word, it filled a hunger she barely admitted to herself. She told herself she wanted only respect, but in truth she longed for security, for someone to shoulder the burden she had carried since childhood. By the time 2019 approached, Isla had been in Dubai nearly 3 years. She was no longer the wide-eyed girl at the airport, nor the trembling novice on her first night shift. She had hardened into routine armored by endurance. Yet the fragility beneath remained, waiting for someone, anyone, to touch it. What she didn't know was that someone had already begun to watch her, to single her out with the kind of attention she had never allowed herself to dream about. And in that gaze lay both the promise of belonging and the seed of her destruction. He had been born in Cairo in 1961, in a neighborhood where buildings leaned tiredly against one another and children learned quickly that ambition had to be louder than hunger. His father worked as a clerk for the Ministry of Transport, a job that kept food on the table but never more than enough. His mother sewed garments in the evenings, her fingers rough from years of fabric and thread. Salim grew up watching the city through narrow windows, already restless, already convinced that his future could not look like his father's. School gave him both a sense of superiority and a burden. He was bright, quick to memorize facts, gifted in the way of seeing patterns others missed. Teachers praised him, but praise didn't erase the reality that his classmates came from families with better connections, more influence, fathers who could purchase opportunity with a signature. Salim, by contrast, had only his hunger. It burned hot, turning into a certainty that he must climb higher, no matter the method. Medical school was the goal, but the path was treacherous. His family could barely afford the tuition, and every semester threatened to be his last. He tutored younger students for coins, sold his mother's pastries at the edges of campus, begged professors for leniency when fees came late. He excelled in anatomy and diagnostics, and though his grades impressed, he knew that brilliance without wealth was a blade with no hilt. You could cut your way forward, but eventually you bled. In his final years, when it seemed he might not make it, fate, or perhaps calculation, introduced him to Sokaina El Amin. She was unlike anyone he had met. Her family came from wealth so old it seemed less earned than ordained. They owned properties, companies, shares in projects Salim had only read about in newspapers. She carried herself with the assurance of someone who never had to check a price tag. Yet beneath that surface lay sharpness, a mind that saw through people, and moods that shifted like sandstorms. Calm one moment, destructive the next. Their meeting was not romantic. He had been invited to a gathering by a classmate whose father was connected to the El Amins. Salim remembered the room. Chandeliers heavy with light, the sound of laughter floating above expensive glassware. He felt like an imposter until she spoke to him. She asked about his studies, his ambitions, her gaze steady, almost appraising. He told her the truth. He wanted to be a doctor, not just for the prestige but for the power it conferred. He wanted to step out of Cairo's alleys and into corridors where decisions shaped lives. She listened, and for reasons he could not immediately understand, she did not turn away. Their courtship was brief, more negotiation than passion. Her family approved. He was bright, disciplined, and most importantly, pliable. He offered ambition, and they offered him a ladder. By the time they married, he had secured a scholarship and financial support that would allow him to complete his studies without fear of expulsion. To outsiders, it looked like a love match. To Salim, it was a contract, a bargain struck with the gods of survival. Sokaina was not an easy partner. She was brilliant, well-read, fiercely articulate, and terrifying when crossed. She could argue a man into silence, could strip his dignity with a single phrase. Yet her strength was not limitless. There were moments when paranoia clouded her eyes, when she became convinced that people were whispering about her, betraying her, conspiring in shadows. Salim learned to manage her storms, to steady the walls when her temper threatened to knock them down. He told himself it was worth it, because with every passing year, her family's wealth became more interwoven with his own future. They moved to Dubai when he was offered a post at a hospital funded partly by El Amin Investments. The city was everything he had imagined. Modern, sleek, a place where appearances mattered as much as skill. Here, Salim flourished, not solely because of his talent, but because doors opened easily when the El Amin name was behind him. He built a reputation for competence, for charm, for a kind of confident leadership that others mistook for self-made. But he knew, without her family, he would still be in Cairo, struggling in the shadows. Their marriage, however, carried an absence that deepened with time. Children never came. At first, doctors offered reassurances. Treatments were tried, consultations sought. Each failure carved another wound. By their 40s, the possibility had shriveled into silence. For Salim, it was a quiet grief, but for Sokaina it became an obsession. She had once dreamed of a house full of heirs to carry her family's name, and now she carried only bitterness. At gatherings, when friends spoke of their children's achievements, she smiled too widely, her hand gripping Salim's arm hard enough to bruise. Later, in private, her words would turn cutting. "What use are you if you cannot give me a child?" Salim withdrew. He sought solace elsewhere, brief encounters that demanded nothing of him beyond what he was willing to give. Affairs came and went, nurses, clerks, strangers at conferences. None lasted and none posed real danger. They were distractions, small rebellions against the iron grip of his marriage. He convinced himself that they meant nothing, that he was still in control. But as the years passed, the emptiness grew. Professionally, he had achieved everything. He was respected, feared, even the kind of man who could make or break a career with a single recommendation. Yet privately, he was hollow. The power he held was borrowed. The wealth he lived on was not his own, and the marriage he inhabited was a gilded cage. He smiled at banquets, but inside he felt the gnawing truth. Without the elements, he was still that boy in Cairo, scrambling to pay tuition with pastries and borrowed coins. Sokaina sensed it. Her paranoia fed on the knowledge that he strayed. She confronted him at times, hurling accusations, then withdrew into silence, cold and punishing. But she never let him go. Divorce was unthinkable. It would fracture appearances, disrupt alliances. She preferred instead to keep him tethered, to remind him at every turn that he owed her everything. He lived like a man under permanent audit, each indulgence weighed, each misstep remembered. It was under this pressure, in this long marriage of control and resentment, that Salim's eyes eventually settled on someone who seemed to embody everything he had lost. Isla was young, earnest, and untouched by the cynicism that stained his own life. She looked at him not with suspicion or calculation, but with something that felt dangerously close to trust. She believed in his authority, in his ability to change her fortunes. With her, he felt not like the indebted son-in-law of the Lemons, but like the man he had once imagined he could become, self-made, powerful, desired. She was different from the fleeting affairs that had filled his past. They had been diversions. She was possibility. He told himself it was destiny, but deep down he knew it was need, raw, unyielding, born from decades of being reminded that his life was not his own. And when Isla told him she was carrying his child, he felt something he had not felt in years: triumph. At 60, after a lifetime of compromises, he believed he had finally created something that was his alone. What he could not see, what he refused to see, was that this fragile dream was built not on freedom, but on the same borrowed foundations that had always defined his life. And the woman who had kept him tethered for decades was not about to let him slip away now, not when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. It began with small gestures, so small at first that Isla hardly recognized them as anything more than professional courtesy. A compliment in passing about the way she calmed an anxious patient. An offer to rearrange her shifts so she wouldn't have to work back-to-back nights. A nod in a crowded corridor when he noticed her from a distance, as though he had singled her out from the dozens of other nurses in identical uniforms. For Isla, who had grown used to being invisible, these fragments of attention were enough to spark something dangerous. The feeling that she mattered. Salim told himself it was mentorship. That was the word he repeated, the justification he offered in his mind. He had always believed in guiding younger staff, and Isla's diligence made her an ideal protégé. But mentorship blurred easily into something else when it crossed late evenings and hushed conversations. He lingered at her station, asking about her family back in Davao. She answered politely at first, hesitant, but once she began she could not stop. She spoke of her mother's fragile health, her siblings' tuition, the endless pressure of remittances. Salim listened with the patience of a man who had been starved of intimacy for decades. She mistook his interest for kindness. The first money transfer happened after her father fell ill. The sum was small by his standards, monumental by hers. He arranged it discreetly, not through the hospital but from his personal account. When the funds arrived, Her family's gratitude poured into long messages filled with blessings and promises to pray for him. She thanked him with tears in her eyes. He brushed them away with the back of his hand, telling her it was nothing. But it was not nothing. It was a thread, and once knotted, it tethered her to him in ways she could neither resist nor untangle. Gratitude shifted into dependency. Each time she faced a crisis, a delayed payment, a sibling's school fees, a hospital bill, he intervened. The money always arrived just in time, as though he were anticipating her needs before she spoke them. She began to feel that her survival in Dubai, perhaps her family's very survival, was bound to his generosity. She hated herself for the relief she felt, for how quickly her pride eroded each time she accepted help. But she also knew she could not afford to refuse. Their meetings changed in tone after that. What began in offices and corridors drifted into late-night encounters in the quiet corners of the hospital. Empty consultation rooms, stairwells where the lights flickered, even the silence of patient rooms when the wards were hushed. They learned how to move like shadows, to close doors softly, to lower their voices until words became breath. For Salim, these moments felt like renewal. At 60, he had long resigned himself to the cold routines of a marriage that provided power but no warmth. With Isla, he rediscovered a softness he thought he had lost. He told himself it was love, or at least the closest he could come to it. He reveled in the way she looked at him, not as a man indebted to his wife's family, not as a director weighed down by politics, but as someone who could protect and provide. That gaze restored a version of himself he had thought extinct. For Isla, the meetings carried a different meaning. She felt conflicted every time she allowed him to draw her close, every time his hand lingered longer than it should. Yet the intimacy filled a loneliness that had gnawed at her since she first arrived in the city. She told herself she was still in control, that she could walk away if she wished. But deep down she knew the imbalance was vast. He held her job, her visa, her family's future in the palm of his hand. And so she leaned into his affection not because she fully trusted it, but because she could not afford to lose it. The affair deepened in silence. Colleagues noticed subtle things. Her schedule adjusted too easily, his eyes following her across crowded wards. But no one dared to say it aloud. In the hospital, rumors were dangerous currency. Everyone had heard of directors who favored nurses, but unless proof surfaced, it remained gossip. Isla lived in constant fear that someone would discover them, that whispers would trail her through the corridors. Yet every time she considered ending it, Salim's reassurance drew her back. He promised stability, told her she was different from anyone else. She wanted to believe him, even as doubt coiled in her chest. Then came the night she confessed. She had been restless for days, rehearsing the words silently, unsure whether to speak them at all. When she finally told him, her voice trembled. She was late. Tests confirmed it. She was carrying his child. For a moment, silence consumed the room, broken only by the hum of an air conditioner. Salim stared at her, eyes wide, and then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not in mockery, but in joy. At 60, after a lifetime of failures and bitterness, the possibility of fatherhood felt like redemption. He took her hands, kissed her knuckles, whispered that she had given him a gift beyond measure. He spoke of new beginnings, of futures that suddenly seemed within reach. His face glowed with an almost childlike awe. Isla felt relief, but it was laced with unease. His excitement was overwhelming, almost reckless, and she could not quiet the questions pressing against her ribs. What place would she hold in his life if his wife discovered? What would happen to her career, her visa, her safety? Yet when he pulled her close and promised that everything would be all right, she let herself believe him, if only because believing was easier than facing the abyss of uncertainty. Their motives could not have been more different. For Salim, the pregnancy was proof that life had not yet abandoned him. It was a second chance, a chance to father a child and perhaps to reclaim the sense of worth he had lost. For Isla, it was both hope and terror. A child meant connection, but it also meant dependence. It tied her future even more tightly to a man whose power could crush her as easily as it lifted her. She walked away from that night with her hands resting lightly over her stomach, whispering prayers she had not spoken since childhood. He walked away imagining himself finally free of the ridicule of being childless, finally a man who could point to flesh and blood and say, "Mine." Neither of them knew that the secret they celebrated in private would soon become the fuse that lit the fire destined to consume them both. The pediatric ward carried a quiet rhythm of its own, softer than the bustling corridors above but no less heavy. Machines hummed with steady patience, nurses moved with muted footsteps, and parents sat in plastic chairs that never seemed to fit their bodies. Among them was Hessa, a woman whose life had been reduced to the span of a single hospital room. Her daughter, Sila, only 12 years old, had been admitted weeks earlier with a chronic illness that required constant monitoring. The girl's frail frame and pale cheeks broke her mother's heart, yet Hessa sat tall, determined to be her guardian against the indifference of the world. She trusted the hospital, or at least she wanted to. It was the same place where her longtime friend Sokena's husband held authority as director. But trust, for a mother, was never complete. She noticed when nurses seemed rushed, when medications were delivered late, when the night staff lingered too long at their station instead of checking on patients. These moments ate at her, small irritations that slowly fermented into suspicion. And suspicion, left unchecked, always demands proof. One evening, after yet another missed dose and another restless night watching Sila twist beneath her sheets, Hessa made a decision. The next day she walked into an electronics shop far from the hospital and asked for something discreet. The salesman raised an eyebrow, but she spoke plainly. She wanted a device that could fit inside the room, hidden from plain sight, able to record everything when she wasn't there. He showed her a small camera disguised as an air freshener. She nodded, bought it without bargaining, and walked out with the strange knowledge that she was about to cross a line. Installing it was easy. Parents were always allowed to bring in small comforts for their children, and no one questioned when Hessa placed a new air freshener near Sila's bed. Inside, the lens blinked to life, a quiet, unblinking witness. That night, as she went home for a few hours of rest, the device began to collect its evidence. For the first week, the recordings showed nothing unusual. Nurses came and went, adjusting drips, checking monitors. Doctors appeared for brief consultations. The ordinary parade of care unfolded, predictable, dull even. Hessa almost laughed at herself for being paranoid. But then, in the second week, she saw something that froze her blood. It was well past midnight. The hallway outside the room was quiet, only the occasional shadow of a nurse passing by. The door opened slowly, carefully, as though the person entering did not want to be noticed. A man stepped in, tall, distinguished, his posture immediately recognizable even in grainy night vision green. It was the director himself, Dr. Salim Rahmani. At first, Hessa thought he had come to check on Sila, perhaps showing personal concern as a gesture of respect toward his wife's friend. But then Isla entered behind him. The nurse walked straight to him, not to the monitors or to the child's bedside. The way they looked at each other left no room for doubt. Hessa pressed her hand to her mouth as she watched. Salim brushed Isla's hand with his own, fingers lingering. He leaned close, whispered something into her ear, and she smiled in a way no professional should while standing in a patient's room. They moved like people who had rehearsed secrecy, bodies angled toward one another, voices too soft for the microphone to capture. It was not medicine. It was intimacy, raw and unhidden, played out beneath the watchful eye of her hidden lens. The recording lasted only minutes, but it was enough. When the door closed behind them, Hessa sat back in her chair, heart racing. She replayed the clip twice, hoping she had misinterpreted, but the truth was undeniable. The hospital's director and a nurse, together, entangled in something that should never have crossed the line between duty and desire. First, she told no one. She locked the footage in her phone, where it glowed like a secret she could not unsee. The days that followed were torture. Every time she sat with Sokena, every time her friend spoke with confidence about her husband's dedication, Hessa felt her chest tighten. Should she say something? Should she protect her friend from humiliation? Or would revealing the truth destroy not only their friendship but also her daughter's fragile sense of safety in the hospital? Fear kept her silent. She knew who Sokena was: sharp, commanding, sometimes unpredictable. A woman like her did not take betrayal lightly. What if she lashed out, not at her husband but at the messenger? And yet, Hessa also knew what it meant to carry a truth too heavy to bear alone. The footage haunted her. She watched it late at night when sleep would not come, each time hoping to find a detail that lessened its weight. But every viewing only deepened the certainty. This was not a misunderstanding, not a misread gesture. It was a relationship, intimate and ongoing, carried out under the nose of everyone who trusted Salim as a leader. The more she thought about it, the more the footage felt dangerous, like a live wire sparking in her hands. If others found out she had recorded it, would she be accused of intrusion? Would Salim retaliate, using his influence to punish her? What if the footage leaked by accident, tearing apart reputations and lives, and she was blamed as the source? For days she wrestled with the decision. Silence promised safety but carried the poison of complicity. Revelation promised honesty but threatened ruin. She looked at Sila, lying pale in her hospital bed, and thought of how much she depended on this place, on these people, for her child's survival. Could she risk turning the director into an enemy? Eventually, it was not logic but loyalty that forced her hand. She sat across from Sokena one afternoon, watching her friend's eyes flash with authority as she dismissed a nurse for incompetence. The thought struck her with sudden clarity. If anyone deserved to know, it was Sokena. Not the board, not the staff, not the authorities. Her friend. She had the right to decide what to do with her husband's betrayal. That evening, with trembling fingers, Hessa opened her phone and cued the footage. She slid it across the table to Sokena, unable to find the words. The images spoke for themselves. For a long moment, Sokena said nothing. She watched with her lips pressed tight, her knuckles whitening as her grip on the phone stiffened. When the clip ended, she replayed it, this time leaning closer, as though dissecting each gesture. Finally, she set the phone down with deliberate calm, her eyes unreadable. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice low, too steady to be natural. Hessa nodded, unsure if she had delivered a gift or a curse. That night, in the privacy of her villa, Sokena watched the footage again and again. Each viewing fed a fire that had been smoldering inside her for years: the humiliation of a childless marriage, the suspicion of infidelity, the paranoia that people whispered behind her back. Now the whispers had form, proof caught by the lens of her closest friend. The hidden camera, meant to protect a sick child, had uncovered something else entirely. A betrayal that threatened not only her marriage but her identity, her authority, her legacy. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The fuse had been lit. What began as a mother's attempt to guard her daughter's safety had become the spark that would unravel every careful lie, every fragile hope, and every illusion of control inside the walls of Dubai General Hospital. The sitting room in the villa was arranged for war. Curtains drawn, the air frozen by the relentless hiss of the AC, and the only light the blue-white glow of a phone replaying the footage. Salim entered expecting the usual chill between them. Instead, he walked into judgment already prepared. The images looped without sound. Night vision green. His own body entering the pediatric ward after hours. Isla behind him, her smile soft, his hand brushing hers. Nothing more needed to be said. The silence in the room was heavy enough to choke. He tried explanations. Mentorship, late rounds, a misunderstanding. But each wilted as soon as it left his lips. Sokena didn't look at the phone. She looked at him. The fury she carried wasn't sudden. It had been fermenting for decades. Failed fertility treatments. The humiliation of being whispered about. The bitter stares at parties when friends paraded children while her arms stayed empty. Now this proof. When he admitted the affair, it wasn't a confession. It was surrender. He reached for salvation in the only truth he believed could soften her. Isla's pregnancy. At 60, he said he would finally be a father. For him, the child was a miracle, redemption, a last chance at meaning. For her, the word landed like a knife. A rival carrying the one thing she could never give him. She didn't raise her voice. Her rage was sharper for being measured. Isla was not simply an indiscretion. She was proof of inadequacy. And proof in her world had to be destroyed. The command came wrapped in calm words. Erase her. Not a plea, not a request. A verdict. Salim's mind split. One part was still the boy from Cairo, who had fought for every scrap, who wanted to clutch this child as proof that his life was more than debts and shadows. The other was the man married into power, who knew what disobedience would cost him. For a moment he imagined running, taking Isla, disappearing into a new city, living smaller but freer. But even as the fantasy took shape, he knew it was impossible. His bank accounts, his career, his passport, everything was entangled in her family's web. To defy her was to be stripped back to nothing. She made the trap clear. If you think you can run, she said, her voice even, I will make you a ghost before you leave the city. The hospital, your reputation, your licenses, gone. And the girl? She will be erased, not hidden. You will lose both her and the child, and you will be left with nothing. The words worked like chains tightening. He wanted to shout, to tell her he would not obey, but the terror of losing everything, of seeing Isla destroyed without even his protection, froze him. He left the villa that night already broken. Over the next days, Isla's presence began to dissolve. Her shifts vanished from the system. Her ID no longer scanned. Clerks marked her as inactive. It was erasure disguised as procedure. Salim signed forms with shaking hands, telling himself he was buying time. He whispered promises to Isla that they would leave soon, that he was arranging safety, but even as he spoke, he knew he was lying to both of them. At Isla's apartment, she clutched the ultrasound strip, the one fragile proof that something real lived inside her. She felt the walls closing. Colleagues avoided her. Calls went unanswered. Yet she still believed he might save her. She believed because to stop believing was to drown. Salim considered fleeing. One night he even packed a small case, passport, cash, a few changes of clothes. He pictured driving straight to her building, telling her to get ready, boarding a plane before Sokena could react. But as he stood at the door, bag in hand, he saw the future unravel. His passport flagged. His accounts frozen. Isla detained, deported, or worse. He dropped the bag back on the bed. Running was only an illusion. Sokena didn't need to repeat her order. She simply reminded him of what she could take away. She spoke of the villa, the hospital, the wealth that wasn't his but that he enjoyed. She reminded him of his father in Cairo, still bitter and small, who had never risen. Without me, she whispered one night as he sat silent beside her. You go back to him. The night of the murder arrived as quietly as a held breath. Isla received a message. It's me. Be ready. Don't open the door for anyone else. She obeyed. Love, fear, and dependence often wear the same mask. Inside her apartment, she had packed a small bag, clothes, her documents, a strip of ultrasound photos. She believed this was the night they would finally leave, that he had chosen her over the prison of his wife's wealth. When the knock came, she hurried to the door, hope flickering despite everything. What happened next exists in fragments. A neighbor later reported muffled voices, then a heavy thud. Forensics noted marks that told two stories at once: overdose and strangulation. The official narrative settled quickly on suicide, neat and efficient. But the details resisted. The missing phone, the drained bank account, the vanished hospital records. She had not just died. She had been deleted. At the villa, Salim returned in the early hours, his shirt damp with sweat, his eyes hollow. Sokena stood at the window, her back straight, her face unreadable. He told her it was done. She nodded once, not in triumph, but in confirmation that her world had been restored. There was no celebration, only silence. In the hospital, the announcement came with antiseptic language. Tragic, untimely, suicide suspected. Staff went through the motions, but whispers grew in the corridors. Why would a woman expecting a child take her own life? Why were her records wiped before her body was even cold? People knew better than to ask aloud, but the questions clung like shadows. Salim kept walking the halls with his old authority, but inside, he was shattered. The dream of fatherhood, the one thing he had clung to, was gone. He told himself he had acted to protect Isla, that without him the end would have been worse. But at night, in the quiet of his study, he saw only her face as the door opened, her hands clutching the ultrasound strip, her belief that he had come to save her. He had come instead as executioner, whether by his own hands or by the weight of obedience he could not escape. Sokaina resumed her life with cold precision. Dinner parties, charity events, perfect composure. She had silenced the threat and tightened her grip. If Salim faltered, if guilt showed on his face, she only needed to look at him once. He remembered who he was without her. Nothing. The affair had promised love to Isla, redemption to Salim, power to Sokaina. Instead it ended in blood, in silence, in erasure. A child unborn, a woman buried, a man broken, and a wife triumphant. And in a drawer, in Hessa's home, the small camera remained. Bought to protect her daughter, it had captured the betrayal that ended a life. She never showed it again. She didn't need to. Its existence, even hidden, was proof that truth can be recorded and still buried. The hospital spoke in the voice of routine. An email went out mid-morning with its careful condolences. Counselors were made available in a windowless room on the ground floor, and a vase of lilies appeared at a desk that did not know where to put lilies. Staff signed their names in a digital book that would be archived and never read again. Schedules tightened around the absence like a bandage. The rota no longer had to bend to accommodate Isla's reliability. Officially, nothing required explanation. Unofficially, everything did. In the cafeteria, conversations reconfigured themselves into safer shapes. People talked about the shortage of beds, about a broken CT slot, about a new vendor for gloves no one liked. Then the voices dropped, only a little, and the other subject threaded in. How swiftly the administration had acted. How the internal memo had landed before breakfast had cooled. How the director's office door stayed closed all afternoon. Eyes drifted to and away from the elevators that led to the 4th floor. The building learned a new choreography. Silence when he entered, small sounds of relief when he left. He walked those corridors like a man wearing his own outline. Outwardly, he approved budgets, signed off on audits, nodded at doctors he once mentored. Inwardly, the film kept skipping, jerking him back to the same frame. A door easing open into a dim hall. A chain sliding. The click of a lock that sounded, to his ears, like a verdict. The flashbacks did not arrive as images at first but as temperatures. A pocket of stairwell air, a little cooler than the rest, would lift the hair on his wrist and he would be there again, between floors, counting his heartbeats because numbers make cowards feel organized. He remembered the weight of the small brown envelope in his jacket. Cash he had told himself was travel money, and the stupid detail that one edge had a crease like a paper cut that never broke skin. He remembered the message he had sent an hour before and the way he had stared at the screen afterward, wishing words could do the work that hands refuse. At home, the air felt staged. Flowers were refreshed by hands neither he nor his wife saw. The dining table reflected light exactly where it was meant to. When relatives visited, their laughter draped itself correctly over the furniture. In that space, Sokaina moved without effort. She resumed charity boards and gallery openings with the same precision she applied to cutting fruit. If others studied her face, they found nothing to interpret. Composure, in her, had been elevated into a philosophy. She never repeated the threat she had made in the days before, because she did not need to. The words had lodged and rooted. You will be a ghost before you leave the city. She will be erased, not hidden. You will lose both her and the child and be left with nothing. Sometimes, when he could not sleep, he heard the threat as mercy, permission to act so that worse would not happen. On other nights, he heard it as what it was, a leash. In pediatrics, Hessa sat with Sela and pretended to concentrate on medication charts she did not understand. The phone with the tucked-away footage lay face down in her bag, as if turning it over could alter what it contained. She had chosen not to show it to anyone else, not because she doubted what it proved, but because she understood precisely what proof costs. The device that had made her feel like a better mother now felt like contraband. Sometimes, while her daughter slept, she could not stop herself from sliding the bag zipper open and checking that the phone was still there, that the recording had not magically erased itself. The knowledge of it changed how she saw rooms, people, even the light. She kept waiting for someone to come ask for it, to demand it. No one did. The absence of that demand told its own story. He tried to rebuild internal order the way he always had, by placing facts in rows. The emails he had sent, the forms he had authorized, the instructions he had obeyed, and the ones he had invented. Triage, he told himself. Save what you can. Make peace with what you cannot. But in the early hours, the metaphor failed. A refrigerator light flicked on in a small apartment inside his skull, and the hum filled his chest. He had told himself he would be a father. He had held the idea long enough to warm it. It would not cool. The flashbacks sharpened into detail. The stairwell bulb had been dead, making the landing a shallow well of shadow. He had paused there to smooth his shirt, absurdly careful. He remembered thinking, say the words quickly, begin with the flight, the clinic in Davao, the stipend for 6 months. Draft the future like a prescription and she will take it. When she opened the door, hope lifted his chest and crushed it at the same time. She wore a soft cotton shirt, hair pulled back, the make-do dignity he had always admired. Her eyes went first to his hands, the way people who have lived on remittances always look for the shape of help, and then to his face where she must have seen the complicated thing there, the plan and the failure of it. He saw now, in retrospect, the moment when running was still possible. If he had dropped the envelope and said, "We leave tonight," if he had chosen poverty over negotiation, perhaps the next seconds would have arranged themselves differently. Instead, he moved into the room and set the envelope on the table. He picked up the glass that was not his and took a sip that was not needed. He told her about a temporary return, about safety, about time. He did not say the only honest sentence available. My wife has told me that if I do not deliver this disappearance, you will not live to board the plane. Her hands moved toward the small bag already packed. Documents, a sweater, the strip of ultrasound photos he had never allowed himself to name. When she realized what he was not offering, her shoulders slumped in a way that made something inside him tilt. She was careful then, as if her carefulness could make the plan gentler. If we wait, she said, not a question, more a test. It becomes harder to hide. He remembered how the room smelled. Not jasmine this time, but soap and boiled rice and the sharpness of a cheap cleaner. A fan blade ticked out of alignment, a small, maddening insistence. He wanted to shout over it, to drown out the noise with a decision he did not have the courage to take. He told himself to buy time. He told himself he could fix this if he could move all the pieces fast enough. He told himself many things that had the exact shape of cowardice. The flashback always slowed here, as if the film stock were thickening. He had placed the envelope closer to her and she had pushed it back, politely, like returning change to a cashier. I won't be your secret, she said, and though the sentence was quiet, it bruised. He reached then, not for her hand but for control. He framed it as safety, as strategy, and the frame cracked the instant it touched the wall. What followed was clumsy, human, nothing like the cold planning he had been practicing for days. A jostled elbow, the edge of the table sliding against his thigh. A tangle of hands when she tried to pass him and he tried to stop the passing, because passing meant the door and the door meant a hallway that contained neighbors and the neighbors contained sound. He would tell himself later that the first contact was accidental, that the two of them made a physics problem of themselves. He would omit how quickly accident converts to intention when someone is afraid. He remembers the cloth because it did not belong to the scene. A dish towel, thin from washing, left near the sink to dry. He remembers the way his hand found it, as if hands are smarter than minds when the mind wants to avoid seeing itself. He remembers the sound of her breath against it, how short breaths sound like pleading even when no language is present. He remembers saying please to no one, please to the room, please to time, please to the part of himself that might choose differently. Regret did not arrive that night as pity. It arrived as comprehension. He understood, with a clarity that has never left him, that once a body is tilted past a certain angle, everything else in the room becomes gravity. He did not plan to stage anything. Staging began on its own. The pill packet on the table. The phone that should not be here anymore. The neatness of objects that ought to be scattered. He saw the scene the way a bureaucrat would need to see it and arranged it like a bureaucrat. He told himself it was mercy to make the story simple. He told himself it was love to keep the scandal from her. He told himself many things that now taste like metal in his mouth. In the mornings that followed, he could perform. He could move paper and appoint committees and warn procurement about a vendor who would not deliver. But small triggers undid him. The static snap when he pulled a file from a plastic sleeve. The smell of bleach in a corridor. The rubber squeak of a gurney wheel that needed oil. Each sound had a twin in the apartment. A lock, a breath, a soft, terminal silence. Word of the hidden camera did not die. It simply went to ground. The story changed rooms. It found its way into the back seats of cars and onto terraces where people set their glasses on coasters that cost more than a week's wage. A friend of a friend, someone would begin, and the rest would be arranged as carefully as a place setting. The act of not naming a thing became the evidence of knowing it. In those circles, the difference between rumor and record is not truth but utility. The record remained clean. The rumor did the work. The board of trustees met in an anodyne conference room and decided nothing. They expressed regret. They affirmed confidence in leadership. They agreed that stability was paramount. A line was added to minutes that would never be released. Reputational risk minimal. Proceed with discretion. The men and women who signed off on that line slept well. They were insulated by a certainty that nothing touches those who hold the papers. Hesse developed the habit of watching doorways. She knew no one would come for her. Fear rarely needs logic. She considered deleting the file, then imagined the exact moment she would want it and have nothing to show. She considered sending it to a journalist she had never met, then thought of Sela's chart and the hands that could make it accidentally vanish. This is how power works when it is working properly. It rearranges your imagination first. The camera returned to its box. The phone lived on low battery. She told herself that keeping the truth safe counted for something. She did not say aloud that safety and silence often wear the same shoes. People in the hospital began to measure time differently. Instead of before and after, they used seasonal shifts, public holidays, conference dates. They built fences around the memory and climbed over them only in the break room, the car, the prayer space no camera reached. 2 new nurses joined pediatrics. Someone trained them and did not tell them what had been lost in the ward they now worked. Life asserted itself in the practical ways it knows. A child laughed at a cartoon. A porter learned a better route between wings. A vending machine jammed and was unjammed. The world never waits for a single story to end. At a gala in late winter, flashbulbs remade the public into the pleasant. The Elamine table gleamed. Sokaina's dress carried light like a verdict. When she stood to greet a couple from Abu Dhabi, her hand took her husband's elbow with the ease of choreography. Guests would tell each other the next day how handsome they looked together, how stable. That word, stable, did as much work as any security team. Stability is a story people tell when they are grateful to believe nothing will spill onto their shoes. If he felt the pressure of being a prop in his own life, he did not show it there. He had relearned the trick of letting his face do only one thing at a time. But later, in the villa's small upstairs bathroom, he would run cold water over his wrists and the flashbacks would line up again, obedient as file folders. The door chain, the towel, the breath, the hush afterward, larger than the room. In an apartment far from the hospital, a box waited for a courier who never came. Inside were gifts that would not be given. A crocheted cap in pale yellow. A small blanket with one loose thread Isla had planned to fix. Her landlord called twice about the lease. When no one answered, he slid a typed notice under the door. Leftover tea leaves hardened in their tin. Dust made democratic claims. Objects are pitiless historians. They record also what doesn't happen. It took longer for him to understand the shape of his consequence. It wasn't the fear of exposure. Exposure requires a world that insists on seeing. It was the realization that even if no one ever spoke her name to him again, she had entered the room his mind saves for the unchangeable. That room has only two pieces of furniture. A chair for what you did, and a chair for what you tell yourself about what you did. He sits between them now and finds no posture that lets him rest. The device that set everything in motion sleeps in its box. Sometimes Hessa moves it to another drawer and then moves it back the way you rearrange a photograph you can't throw away. She knows herself better now. Not nobler, not braver, only more precise about what her life can withstand. The lens did what it was built to do, witness. The rest was human work. And if a single image is left to stand for the whole thing, it is not the villa, not the office with its door, not even the bed with its cooling sheet. It is a child's hospital room at 3 in the morning. A cartoon paused on a mute screen, a monitor pulsing its indifferent rhythm, a mother's empty chair, and a plastic air freshener that was not an air freshener at all. A camera bought to keep a sick girl safe watched love impersonate care, watched power strip a life to silence, watched the beginning of the end and captured it in the soft green glow of night.